So this lecture is going to be about adolescents' relationships with siblings. So the nature of sibling relationships and adolescence. Sibling relationships during adolescence have characteristics that set them apart both from relationships with parents and relationships with friends. Adolescents rate their sibling relationships similarly to those with their parents in companionship and importance, but more like friendships with respect to power, assistance, and their satisfaction with the relationship. Young adolescents often have emotionally charged relationships with their siblings that are marked by conflict and rivalry, but also by nurturance and support. As children mature from childhood to early adolescence, sibling conflict increases, with adolescents reporting more negativity in their sibling relationships than in their relationships with their peers, and less effective conflict resolution with their parents. Adolescents see aggression towards siblings as more acceptable than aggression towards friends, which sometimes leads to behavior between siblings that is absolutely ruthless. So consider this 16-year-old girl's account of her behavior towards her younger sister. I'm kind of mean to her just because, she's my sister. Sometimes I tell her, like, oh, just because you don't have any friends, that doesn't mean you can come and hang out with my friends, because that's something that usually gets to her. So you tend to lean towards that to make her go away. So one time she kept on trying to play with me and my friend, and we were yelling at her. We hurt her a little bit, and she started crying, and I wish it didn't happen. We were just really mad at her, and I don't know why, and she just really wanted someone to play with. So you could see, like, sometimes you hear some, like, really cruel things out of adolescents' mouths towards their siblings. Over the course of adolescence, adolescents' relationships with siblings, and especially with younger siblings, becomes more egalitarian, but also more distant and less emotionally intense. Although there's patterns of change in sibling relationships that differ between same-sex and mixed-sex dyads. In same-sex dyads, intimacy increases between pre-adolescence and mid-adolescence, and then declines somewhat. In mixed-sex dyads, the pattern is the opposite. Intimacy drops between pre-adolescence and mid-adolescence, and then increases. Just to be clear as to what I mean by a dyad is something that consists of, two parts to it. So, like, if we're talking about, if we have two sisters, they would be a same-sex dyad, as opposed to a brother and a sister, or two brothers and a sister. Those would be mixed-sex dyads, although if there's three, then we might want to call it a triad, right? In fact, late adolescence, brothers and sisters are closer than our same-sex siblings, although both types of relationships become closer as individuals move into adulthood. Despite these changes over time, though, there is considerable stability in the quality of sibling relationships between childhood and adolescence. Siblings who are relatively closer during middle childhood are relatively closer as adolescents. A network of relationships. The adolescent's interpersonal world is a web of interconnected relationships. The quality of the parent-adolescent relationship influences the quality of relations among brothers and sisters. Harmony and cohesiveness in the parent-adolescent relationship are associated with less sibling conflict and a more positive sibling relationship. In contrast, adolescents who experience maternal rejection and negativity are more aggressive with siblings. By the same token, children and adolescents learn much about social relationships from sibling interactions, and they bring this knowledge and experience to friendships outside of the family. In poorly functioning families, aggressive interchanges between unsupervised siblings often provide a training ground within which adolescents learn, practice, and perfect antisocial and aggressive behavior. The reverse is true as well. The quality of adolescents' relationships with their friends influences how they interact with their siblings. The quality of the sibling relationship also affects adolescents' psychological well-being. Positive sibling relationships contribute to adolescents' academic competence, sociability, health, autonomy, and self-worth. Having a close sibling relationship can partially ameliorate the negative effects of family stress and of not having friends in school, and siblings can serve as sources of advice and guidance. Of course, siblings can influence the development of problems too. Younger sisters of adolescent mothers are relatively more likely to engage in early sexual activity and to become pregnant during adolescence. Siblings also influence each other's drug use and antisocial behavior. Behavior genetics and adolescent development. One topic of interest to researchers who study adolescents and their siblings concerns how closely siblings resemble each other in characteristics such as intelligence, personality, and interests. Recent advances in the study of behavioral genetics, or it says behavior genetics on your board or on your screen, have provided new insights into this issue, as well as a host of others concerning the joint impact of genes and the environment on development. So behavior genetics is the scientific study of genetic influences on behavior. Researchers examine this issue in three main ways. Number one, studying adolescents who are twins to see whether identical twins are more similar than fraternal twins. Two, studying adolescents who have been adopted to see whether adopted adolescents are more like their biological parents than like their adoptive parents. And three, studying adolescents and their siblings and stepfamilies to see whether similarity between siblings varies with their biological relatedness. In addition to examining whether and how much given traits are genetically versus environmentally determined, researchers also ask how these two sets of factors interact. For example, whether the same environment affects people with different genetic makeups in different ways, or whether people with different genetic makeups evoke different reactions from others. So, genetic and environmental influences on adolescent development. That first kind of bullet point there under behavior genetics is where we are right now. Okay. In the studies of genetic and environmental influences on adolescent development, researchers distinguish between two types of environmental influences. The two types are listed there as well: shared environmental influences and non-shared environmental influences. Shared environmental influences are factors in the environment that individuals, such as siblings, have in common and that make the individuals similar in personality and behavior. Non-shared environmental influences are factors in the environments of individuals that are not similar and that, as a consequence, make the individuals different from one another. Studies indicate that both genetic and non-shared environmental influences, such as differential parental treatment, peer relations, and school experiences, are particularly strong in adolescents. In contrast, Shared environmental factors, such as family socioeconomic status or the neighborhood in which two siblings live, are less influential. In studies of siblings, non-shared environmental influences can include factors within the family as well as outside of it. For example, if two siblings are treated very differently by their parents, this would be considered a non-shared environmental influence. This sort of non-shared environment, that is, the non-shared environment that results from people having different experiences within what would appear to be the same context, seems to be the most important. Genetic factors strongly influence many qualities that previously had been assumed to be shaped mainly by the environment. Aggressive behavior is especially driven by genetics, although shared and non-shared environmental influences on adolescents' antisocial behavior, including aggression, also have been found. Genetic factors also have been linked to various emotional and behavioral problems, such as risk for suicide and depression, and alcohol dependence. Research also has found strong genetic influence on adolescent competence, self-image, and self-conceptions. Intelligence in adolescence, like an IQ score, right, is also under strong genetic control, with genetic influences compounding over time and ultimately becoming more influential than the family environment. The maturation of brain regions associated with complex reasoning also becomes increasingly under genetic control over time. Genetic influences on school performance, in contrast to intelligence, are more modest. Many studies have shown that adolescents with the same genetic predispositions, such as genes associated with risk for depression, develop differently if they grow up in different environments. For instance, genetic influences on antisocial behavior are stronger among adolescents who have delinquent peers, and weaker among those who do well in school. Genetic influences on intelligence are stronger in families with highly educated parents because the influence of genes on intelligence is stronger in environments that provide more learning opportunities, allowing children to benefit from their genetic advantages. In other words, genes may shape tendencies, but whether these tendencies are actualized often depends on the environment. So why are siblings often so different? If the family is an important influence on development, how can we explain the fact that siblings who grow up in the same family often turn out to be very different from one another? One answer is that siblings actually may have very different family experiences because they have been treated differently by their parents. They perceive similar experiences in different ways, or because they grew up in the same household at different times in the family's life. One brother may describe his family as close-knit, while another may have experienced it as distant. One girl may describe her family life as plagued with argument and conflict, while her sister describes it as peaceful and agreeable. Even though we may assume that children growing up in the same family have the same environment, this is not necessarily the case. As you might expect, unequal treatment from mothers or fathers often creates conflict among siblings and is linked to a variety of problems such as depression, antisocial behavior, and early pregnancy. Studies also show that differences in siblings' real and perceived family experiences are related to different patterns of development. Better adjusted adolescents are more likely than their siblings to report that they had close relationships with their parents, that their relationships with brothers or sisters were friendly, that they were involved in family decision-making, and that they were given a high level of responsibility around the house. As they get older, adolescents appreciate the reasons for parents treating siblings differently. Sibling relationships are strained only when this differential treatment is perceived as unfair. Treating siblings differently may actually be a good thing for parents to do so long as each sibling is treated well. When siblings are treated differently by their parents, they get along better, presumably because this differential treatment makes them feel unique and lessens sibling rivalry. So sibling rivalry is one of the definitions up there. It's competition between siblings, often for parental attention. Perhaps you have a brother or sister whom you resemble more than you'd like. So much, in fact, that you've had a hard time establishing your own personality. This happens with twins often, right? When siblings feel this way, they often deliberately try to be different from each other, a phenomenon known as sibling de-identification. So the definition there, the process through which siblings deliberately try to be different from each other. An adolescent whose brother or sister is a star athlete, for instance, may shun sports and focus on cultivating other types of talents, perhaps in academics or in the arts, in order to diminish feelings of competition. Similarly, although having an older sibling who is academically successful seems to promote younger adolescents' achievement, too much academic support from an older sibling may actually undermine a younger adolescent's success in school. In addition to having different experiences inside the family, siblings also may have very different experiences outside the family, at school, with friends, in the neighborhood. These contexts provide yet another source of non-shared environmental influence. Because factors other than the family environment shape adolescent development and behavior, siblings may turn out very different if they have divergent experiences outside the home. So Alfred Adler was part of the psychoanalytic movement in the early 1900s in Vienna, Austria. So he used to hang out with Freud. As a founder of one of the founders of the psychoanalytic movement, they were trying to figure out the causes of personality, right? If you remember Freud, he really focused on the id, the ego, the superego, and those sexual urges that were part of the id, those sexual and aggression urges. And Freud said that those are the things, these pieces, the id, ego, superego, are the key to personality development. Okay, so he stressed these things like internally, the unconscious, the things that are going in, those struggles within the person inside, right? Adler disagreed with him. So he was originally part of Freud's small group and is considered a co-founder of the psychoanalytic movement, but Adler took issue with Freud's focus on the libido, an internal source of motivation for behavior and development, and instead Adler highlighted the important role of external social influences on personality development. And as you can see, based on everything we've talked about up until now, you can see how important the external world is in shaping our behavior, right? He didn't believe in breaking people into parts the way Freud did with the id, ego, and superego. Rather, Adler viewed people as indivisible. A central part of his theory is something called holism. So he founded his own theory as he broke away from Freud. It still has we call it like a psychodynamic nature to it, but he broke off from Freud and he started his own theory called the individual psychology or Adlerian psychology. So he viewed people as indivisible, which is actually where that word individual psychology comes from. It didn't translate so well necessarily from German to English. So that word individual, sometimes people think he was stressing the individual, when really he was stressing that we're indivisible and we interact with our environment. A central part of his theory is holism, which is we are indivisible and interconnected beings with society. We are influenced by a combination of our biology, the society, and the meaning making we have about our experiences within all of those things. So as you can see from an earlier slide, we talked about how two children living in the same household could have very, very different experiences because, according to Adler, it's because we all make our own meaning about a situation. We have a choice as to what we do with the way we are treated, right? He talked about how we are born inferior in the sense that we're like little and helpless. So we all, as humans by nature, have this sense of inferiority, these feelings of inferiority. And we're always striving to overcome that sense of inferiority. So he says that that's a huge, big part of personality development is our striving to overcome this sense of inferiority we feel. Some people, like as they move through life, may gather evidence like, yes, I actually am inferior, right? And every time they encounter messages from society that they're inferior, they grab onto those messages. And they may really develop what Adler called an inferiority complex. Or as you're moving through life, you may gain evidence from a young age that you're super important. And that shapes your personality. So, he talked about like a pampered child, a child who gets whatever they want when they want it. That's going to shape your personality, according to Adler. Anyway, so he wasn't inner focused the way Freud was. He wasn't like, let's just talk about these inner workings of the id, ego, and superego, and the conscious and unconscious, which we can't even really see. But rather, he was stressing the importance of how our whole selves interacts with society in this holistic way. One of the aspects outside of the self that Adler targeted as shaping personality is the role of the family system, including sibling influences, as a central part of personality. A key construct for him was how we compare ourselves to other people and power dynamics within the family. And this is key to creating our sense of self. So who am I in relationship to others? Who am I in relationship to my big brother? Who am I in relationship to my father and my mother? Okay, so as we develop these ideas about ourselves, we create our personality, and we can end our sentences, I am, others are, the world is, which kind of shapes us. It's our lifestyle, he called it. It's our style of life by these interactions. So one of the things to keep in mind with Adler is, let's say you have a family of, let's say, five total kids in the family. And one of them is 16 years old. And then the next one in the family is like 9 years old, right? And then after that, an 8-year-old, a 7-year-old, a 6-year-old, or whatever, right? The 16-year-old, he would almost view that 16-year-old as being in their own group, okay? So it's almost like the 16-year-old is like an only child because they're not part of a grouping of kids in the family that are closer than age, right? So a 16-year-old is sort of like the only child because there's a gap of more than about 5 years between the 16-year-old and the 9-year-old. And 5 years is a good number to work with. So if you think about your family, if you and your brother, you and your sister are a few years apart, you would be kind of considered your own grouping. Whereas if you're 5 years apart, they're probably part of another grouping. Another way to think about the groups is, so like that 16-year-old is their own group. Then let's say there's the 9-year-old, 8-year-old, and 7-year-old, and a 6-year-old, right? So they're a group of 4. The 9-year-old is sort of like the oldest child in that grouping, right? So they may even view themselves similar to being an oldest child because they were sort of the ringleader of that group, right? So he talked a lot about birth order. He talked about how birth order kind of influences and can shape our personality. But he never said stuff like, you are definitely going to be this way if you're a firstborn, and you're definitely going to be this way if you're an only child, and you're definitely going to be this way if you're the youngest child. He thought there's some clues as to some common features that we find within those groupings that can kind of help us understand personality development. But he also talked about how it's not just necessarily what order you were born in, but the role that you take on, how you view yourself. Do you view yourself as the oldest child? Do you view yourself as the baby of the family? So it's all about the meaning that you've given to the situation, okay? How you see yourself within the family, how you see yourself in relationship to others, that shapes your personality. Okay, so he talked about the importance of egalitarianism, so the equal treatment of siblings, as an important preventative measure in promoting self-esteem within a family. Building on the tenets of Adler's theory, there was a man named Rudolf Dreikurs who actually started my school in downtown Chicago, Adler University. It was called the Adler Institute. It had different names over time, but Rudolf Dreikurs, which is Adler's student, has passed on his teachings, and he did a lot of writing about parent education and how parents should interact with their children based on the workings of Adler. So he has a lot of books out there about promoting positive family relationships. And from Dreikurs and Adler, there's a very, very famous book out there called Positive Discipline by Jane Nelson, Lynn Lott. And positive discipline is used in schools. It's used by parents. They have a ton of books, workshops, and so on. And it's all based on Adler's theory of how we find our place within the family and how we make meaning of our interactions in our family. So family constellation, just to point that out there on the board on your screen, is like where you are within the family and how you see yourself within the family, okay? So Adler's ideas about the centrality of sibling relationships or sibling experience in personality development were a basis for his interest in birth order effects on individual development, and they also were central in his ideas about sibling relationship processes, particularly siblings' rivalry around parents' attention and time and for family resources. According to Adler, rivalry between siblings is grounded in each child's need to overcome potential feelings of inferiority. As a means of reducing competition, siblings often differentiate or de-identify, develop different personal qualities, and choose different niches. Okay? And so, again, if my brother's a star athlete, I'm going to find another way, right? I can't compete with that. Or I might compete with that, right? But I might get really discouraged if I compete with the star athlete. So often, like, the oldest child will find their niche. So their niche is academics. So then the next child has to find their niche because they don't want to necessarily compete with the niche that was already found. So in this way, sibling differentiation is a key dynamic in families. So this week you're going to be reading a short entry I wrote about sibling relationships and Alfred Adler, along with someone named Jay Coker. We wrote this article or this entry in this encyclopedia. So that will be part of your readings. And then you're going to use this lecture and that paper to complete your writing assignments for this week. It's going to be about sibling relationships, okay? One last slide is just a little cartoon Child of the month. I'm not sure that this degree of competition is entirely healthy. This really reminded me of Alfred Adler. One child getting that preferential treatment by a parent, if it's not egalitarian, if we're not treating children in some kind of equal way, this other child is going to take their feelings of inferiority that we're all born with, that we all have, because all children are smaller and weaker than the adults around them, and we're dependent on others. So this other child's really going to have a personality that is shaped by like really solidifying that feeling of inferiority, and they're going to be discouraged through life. So just something as simple as how your parents treat you, how you see yourself in your family, in relationship to your siblings, really sets a real big foundation for how discouraged we are as we go through life, according to Alfred Adler. So I'm going to end it there, and use this lecture to help you with your paper along with the readings.